Welcome to Books in Five, where we interview the authors of recently published books on relevant topics. We'll be asking the author 5 questions, and they will have 5 minutes to answer each one. I'm very excited about my guest today, as he has written an eye-opening new book detailing a fascinating spiritual practice. Manvir, thank you so much for being our guest on Books in Five. Please introduce yourself, the title of your book, and where you are joining us from today.
Yeah, hi. Thanks a lot for having me, Pavan. My name is Manvir Singh. I am an anthropologist at the University of California, Davis. I grew up in New Jersey, but I currently live in California in the Central Valley, right by Sacramento. So
Great.
that's where I'm joining.
And, and the title of your book.
Yeah, and my book is Shamanism, the Timeless Religion.
Great. Let's begin with our first question. The book explores the spiritual practice of shamanism, a phenomenon that has fascinated humanity for millennia. Tell us more about your motivation to investigate this topic and how did you go about gathering the necessary research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my motivation began early in my PhD. So I was a new PhD student at Harvard studying human evolutionary biology, so like evolutionary anthropology. And I wanted to go to a place where there is a rich indigenous religion, where there's a rich tradition of justice. I was really interested in rules and law, but also in the supernatural. And so I decided to go to this place, this archipelago off the west coast of Sumatra in West Indonesia called the Mentawai archipelago. I had decided to go to this place, honestly, just like one of my colleagues had suggested, oh, you might be interested. Um, there seems to be really interesting cultural diversity on this island. And I, like so many people, was interested in shamanism. I had this general hazy sense of shamanism. I knew it was kind of associated with religion and ritual and music, psychoactive substances, but I didn't really have a great concrete sense of what it was like. And so then I finally get to the island. I fly to Malaysia, and then from Malaysia to Sumatra. Sumatra, I get on a ferry. I take this ferry to this port town, Siberut. Um, I have a huge, complicated um, journey trying to find a guide, but finally I get a guide and I start visiting these communities. And so, just for some context, the Mentawai are what we call horticulturalists, forager horticulturalists. So they're like small scale cultivators. They grow these big palm trees, fruit trees, root crops. They grow pigs or raise pigs. And then they also hunt. They hunt monkeys, um, deer, boar. And so I'm visiting these Mentawai communities. I'm traveling the island. And immediately I find very saliently and strikingly these shamans. They're called sikere among the Mentawai. And the Sikere are very um, prominent visually. They're really conspicuous. So they in this part of Siberut, in the southern part of Siberut, they very often only wear a loincloth. So the Mentawai more generally have adopted clothes, but the Sikere still keep loincloths. They very often have their bodies tattooed, their arms, their legs, their chest, their face, their hands. When they're especially old, their feet. They grow long hair. Uh, and then when it's time for ceremonies, they cover their bodies in turmeric. They put beads on their arms. They put bells. They put flowers and leaves. Um, and then they have these rituals. And that first summer, I didn't really see the rituals in depth. I kind of heard them from afar. I would hear these sikere singing and dancing while staying with them. They would also sing for me, but I had a really hazy impression of what the rituals actually looked like. Um, but yeah, so they're very visually conspicuous, but then they're also really socially significant. And I immediately noticed they're incredibly prestigious. When they walk in, everyone notices them. It's like the social gravity bends around them. Um, and then they are important in so many domains of life, and they're really at the intersection of so much of life, of um, rituals like the spiritual, but also medicine, politics. Um, and so I was incredibly enchanted or captivated just after that first summer, this superficial understanding of it. And I came home and I started to read much more on shamanism. And I realized that what I had seen this first summer was, in fact, at least as anthropologists have argued, a reflection, a manifestation of a tendency that seems to occur more widely. Um, um, and of course, there's been this long history of studying and thinking about shamanism. It was first associated with the Siberia, then there was an appreciation that maybe what we had seen in Siberia appears in other places. And so I really directed my my PhD to better understanding shamanism. And so a big part of how I've come to understand it is through my fieldwork, most prominently with the Mentawai. I've also done fieldwork in Colombia, but then also I've just read prodigiously. I've traveled a lot, and so the book tries to both, tell an important story about shamanism and its manifestations around the world, but also really tracing my own journey from the Mentawai to Colombia to France to Burning Man, all of its kind of timeless and ubiquitous echoes in diverse places.
Let's move on to our second question. You write about how shamanism can be best understood as a mind technology. What do you mean by this term, and what are the implications?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I started to study shamanism and tried to understand what it was, and immediately I was trying to find what is the best analogy. Are they like doctors? Are they like priests? Are they, how should I best understand this? And after really engaging with it, and for context, I mean, as you are probably familiar, and as many of your viewers are probably familiar, there is a kind of primitivist association with shamanism. It's thought to be archaic, primitive, so-called primitive, confined to remote societies. And so while studying it, I started to recognize that I don't actually think that's the best way of thinking about it. I think instead, what's a more powerful and useful way of thinking about it is like you just quoted, a mind technology. This cluster of practices and beliefs that humans reliably develop all over the world in diverse places, including faraway places, and including in the past, but also in contemporary contexts. Um, and when I think about it as a mind technology, I think of it foremost as an incredibly rich, sensorially vivid experience in which a person, through a specialist, feels like some domain of uncertainty is being managed. And the idea is that, like, we humans really often we believe that uncertainty in our lives is overseen by invisible forces or agents, gods, ghosts, witches, ancestors. And what shamanism is doing is that this practitioner, um, seems to transform before our eyes, seems to become a different kind of human, allowing them to apparently engage with these unseen forces. And so, a lot of what comprises shamanism, the music, the psychoactive drugs, the dramatic initiations, I think is contributing to this really core cognitive technological function, that of creating a rich simulating experience, a rich simulation, kind of a very rich, sensorially vivid experience in which you feel that the specialist can contend with the forces that control, um, control uncertainty. And I think of like two things as really critical for that, both different forms of transformation. One is just how the shaman transforms in our eyes, essentially and fundamentally over time. So a lot of shamanic traditions, the practitioner engages in self-denial. They might have these really dramatic initiations like death and rebirth ceremonies. Where I work in Mentawai, or with the Mentawai, they have these ceremonies in which they magically treat their eyes, and it's believed that over the course of these ceremonies, over the course of this treatment, their eyes transform so that they can see gods and ghosts. Um, but there are myriad ways in which the shaman is understand to become a different kind of human over time. So that's one thing that I think of as really critical, and another is trance. You can think of it, the first one as a kind of longer term transformation, and trance as a transformation in the moment. And you can think of this intuition. If you came to me, Pavan, and you were like, or I came to you and I was like, Pavan, I know you really, you've been dealing with this illness. I can speak to the goddess who causes this illness. You would think, Manvir, you're just a regular guy. But then, you know that my skeleton was cut open, new things were put inside, I fasted. You think, okay, maybe he is a bit different. But then if I came to you and I was like, rain goddess, like, deal with this illness, that would not seem compelling. There's something much more compelling about in that moment, my eyes roll back, my mouth is frothing, I'm speaking in a voice that's mine, I'm doing other superhuman feats. All of these, I think, contribute to the sense that this person is doing something that fundamental humans cannot. And so that is really, it's these two forms of transformation that I think are so critical to um, to the function more generally of shamanism in allowing a person to feel like uncertainty is being dealt with, if that's clear.
Let's move on to our third question. It is critical to understand the deep history of humanity's oldest religious practice and how it shaped the evolution of societies. Can you showcase for us the myriad ways that shamanism emerged over time across so many different places?
For sure, yeah. That's a great question, and that is something that I really try to focus on in the second half of the book. After really establishing that shamanism is this powerful cognitive technology, it even has the potential to heal, I think, or to at least have therapeutic effects. We can think about its myriad manifestations across societies. Um, so there are a couple of domains that I've really investigated. One has been deep history. So as some of your viewers might know, there are all of these claims that deep in human history, if you look at rock art, if you look at burials, there's evidence of Paleolithic shamanism, of ancient shamanism. And while I was writing this book, I was actually living in Southwest France, not too far from one of these caves. And through a connection, I was able to go into one of these largely pristine caves and see some of this rock art. Um, what I ultimately conclude in the book is that it's very hard to actually interpret something like rock art, things like burials, as evidence of Paleolithic shamanism. I mean, you have incredibly evocative and interesting scenes. You have individuals who are half human, half animal, composites of different animals. They seem imaginative, spiritual, creative, but I think it's very hard to infer shamanism from that. Something that I've found more important, actually, is just how reliably shamanism seems to appear across societies. So there was one study, it looked at, I forget, something like 30 hunter-gatherers, 31 hunter-gatherers. They found shamanism in 24, and then I think they were actually missing about 3 or 4. So it actually is more like 28 hunter-gatherer societies that have been checked. There seem to be shamanic traditions, and even the exceptions are really interesting. So one of them is the Siriono. They live in South America, and their population became very small. They actually seem to have lost shamanism. A couple of these populations, hunter-gatherers that don't have shamanism, actually just have very small populations, and so maybe they can't sustain that cultural complexity, or they lost it. Um, but yeah, so you find it really widespread among hunter gatherers. You find it more generally very widespread in non industrialized societies. Now, someone might respond and say, well, how do you know then that it has popped up so reliably versus that it existed in some historical tradition and then it has diffused? And one way that we can at least have more confidence in this reliable convergent evolution hypothesis is that we see it also emerge throughout human history. A great example, one that I just talk about a bunch in the book, is Abrahamic religions, and I want to talk about Abrahamic religions, or I've described them because that is a domain where people have often been very quick to dismiss comparative efforts. There is an attempt to really see a lot of Western history and the history of particular religions as without anthropological analogs. But what's very striking is that if we are just going off of a what I think is very defensible definition of shamanism, a practice in which you have non-ordinary states, engagement with unseen realities, and services like healing and divination, you find shamanic traditions just popping up so regularly in the history of Abrahamic religions. I mean, the Hebrew prophets seem to qualify very simply and very straightforwardly as shamans. Um, the early Christian church is very shamanic. And then you have, throughout the history of Abrahamic religions, actually a really interesting trend where there's a tension between a centralizing tendency, a tendency to uh, locate the control over spiritual and supernatural authority in an institution, and this more shamanic energy, this more ecstatic tendency where you kind of have more charismatic upstarts. If you think about many of the splinter groups of, just to choose one example, of Christianity, they start out very shamanic. I mean, the Shakers are called Shakers because they shook. The Quakers are called Quakers because they quaked. The early Mormons had very ecstatic practices that I think would in some instances qualify as shamanic. And even if we look at the fastest growing religions today, Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity, those are often very shamanic. You have a pastor who is entering some non-ordinary state that is marked by speaking in tongues. There channeling or engaging with a holy spirit, a sky god, very often is how it's conceptualized. And then they're healing or providing prophecy. That is like quintessential shamanism. So I think shamanism is ubiquitous, and I think once we get past some of our primitivist biases, we can really appreciate how universal its appeal is.
Let's move on to our fourth question. There are a number of chapters that reveal the resonance of shamanistic traditions into the present day. What is happening in the 21st century that people are turning to new versions of old solutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there are different ways in which shamanic traditions are resonating in the contemporary world, including in contemporary industrialized societies. There are some literal shamans. There are individuals who I would say, are without a doubt literal. They qualify as shamans. I mean, I talked about Pentecostal pastors. I think are clear shamans. But there's also an entire you might say practice of neo-shamanism. So I mean, I live in Northern California. It's popular in Northern California. It's popular throughout really the United States into Northern Europe, probably Canada, if I'm guessing. Um, and I think sometimes there is this desire to separate out neo-shamanism from what people perceive as traditional shamanism. They'll say, oh, neo-shamanism is X and traditional shamanism is Y. But that's something I don't entirely endorse or think is totally legitimate. I think all shamanic traditions are constantly dynamic. They're evolving within their particular context. They're responding to world forces. I mean, the shamanism that you find among the Mentawai that I've studied is in many ways very reflective of globalized forces and in a similar way to neo-shamanism. So I think neo-shamanism is honestly a very like clear form of shamanism just with a peculiar history and cultural context. Um, but then so these are what I would call literal shamans, but then there are also what I would call shaman analogs. And so and some people don't like when I talk about this, but one example I talk about in the book is a whole domain of experts that I call hedge wizards. These are specialists who promise control over ultimately uncontrollable systems. A quintessential example is a money manager. So as far as we know, the best data show that money managers do not beat the market, that on average you will probably make more if you just invest in an index fund than if you go with a money manager. And nevertheless, money managers make prodigious sums of money. Many people rely on them. And I think what they're doing in many ways is very analogous to what shamans are doing. They're promising control over an uncontrollable system. They're competing amongst themselves. There's a market essentially for magic that drives the evolution of this hyper compelling charismatic specialist class. There are different ways in which money managers build credibility, and I think this fundamental one of like otherness of transformation is maybe less relevant for money managers, although some people argue that it is. But I think they just use different tools for building charismatic and credibility, for building charisma and credibility, superhuman work schedules, claims of like using tools or having mathematical knowledge that allows them to discern kind of invisible or opaque trends, um, claiming like a special amount of inside knowledge. Whatever they do, there's a whole class of practices that they use and narratives that they use to buttress this sense of their kind of special divinatory power. So I think you'd find these trends across the board, and I think a lot of this coincides with an increase more generally, not just of interest in shamanism, but in the spiritual, in the magical. I mean, you have a lot of people who are increasingly interested in tarot and astrology. There's an entire domain of TikTok called Witch Talk, and I think there are two things that probably contribute here. One, I think it's just uncertain times. There's just like a general sense that during times of uncertainty, people turn to these forms of magic, of supernatural practice. But then there's also the fact that there's a lot of disenchantment with institutionalized religion. And so I think as people turn away from the institutionalized religions in which they grew up, they turn to these more intimate, ecstatic, um, personal forms of spiritual practice, of which shamanism and shamanic like things are very common.
Let's conclude with our fifth question. A book on modern shamanism wouldn't be complete without a look at the appeal of psychedelics. What can you tell us about the facts and the fiction surrounding the use of substances that alter the mind?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because that is something I try to cover in the book, and you know, the book I think of as really about the diverse manifestations, the timeless appeal of this practice that we tend to otherwise exoticize. Um, but nevertheless, I don't want to overstate the claim because I do think people like to make claims about universal tendencies, and I think they especially like to do it about psychedelics. So in the book, I talk about something that I call the GAPS hypothesis, the global ancient psychedelic shamanism hypothesis. So if you read a lot of the materials on psychedelics, you often find these claims like psychedelics have been used around the world for millennia, often in context for therapeutic healing, and particularly in shamanic contexts. And I think that like actually wildly distorts the anthropological evidence. So if we're talking about first, it depends on what we're talking about when we're talking about psychedelics. People often mean a particular class of like what we call hallucinogens that act via the serotonin 2A receptor. So things like LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, psilocin, bufotenine, um, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and the anthropological evidence, like if you actually look at where we have reliable evidence, either observational or ethnobotanical, so you have evidence from actual like plants, reliable ethnographic evidence of the traditional use of psychedelics is limited to the Americas, to the Rio Grande area, so the area essentially at the border of the United States and Mexico, which is the native range of peyote, and southwards. So um, yeah, so it's a very small like geographic range in humanity more generally. There's no reliable evidence, with the possible exception of southern Africa, which we could talk about. There's a lot of interesting claims being made about southern Africa, but putting that aside for a moment, there's no strong reliable evidence of traditional use of psychedelics outside of the Americas. And even within the Americas, it's a small number of cultures, probably about 5% of cultures in the Americas. We have good evidence for yopo, so for bufotenine snuffs, for pre-colonial use of psilocybin mushrooms, and for peyote. That's it. Ayahuasca is like, people love to make all of these claims about, oh, ayahuasca has been used for thousands of years in the Amazon. There's no strong evidence for pre-colonial ayahuasca use, and it even seems like those places where it's like most touristed today, the Peruvian Amazon, that might be a post-colonial phenomenon. It may have spread there with rubber traders. So yeah, I there are all of these claims nevertheless about psychedelics being so important, and I think it's because it's a tool for taming and domesticating and drawing appeal to psychedelics. I think when people are trying to push the broader acceptance of psychedelics, there's the sense that they're dangerous, that they're untested, that they have long been kind of demonized in the Western popular imagination, and so these claims about global and ancient use, I think, are a way of trying to cleanse those away and replace them with something more appealing. But I think it really misrepresents the history, and I also think it misrepresents how people actually use them in these contexts. So, I'm saying that serotonergic psychedelics are used in a small number of cultures, but in those cultures, it's actually incredibly diverse and interesting. And so people will claim, oh, they're used for shamanic healing. But you find, yeah, and they not only do they say shamanic healing, but they often like have this thing in mind that resembles modern psychotherapeutic use, where they imagine that the shaman is giving it to the patient like a drug. Much more often, the shaman is taking it to access special powers. Um, and it's not only used for healing, but it's very often entangled with things that are much darker, like sorcery. So a point that I've just wanted to make is that I think it's it's exciting and interesting if they're widespread and they resemble shamanic use, but I think there's much greater value in actually um, representing the ethnographic and anthropological evidence as it is, rather than distorting it for ideological purposes.
Manvir, that has been our 5 questions. You've answered them in 5 minutes. Let's move on to our bonus questions. Manvir, tell us more about your career trajectory. Why did you want to become an anthropologist in the first place?
Yeah, I ended up in anthropology in a kind of unexpected way. As a kid, I was like obsessed with animals. I was an animal nerd. I was also really into mythology. I was always a bit of a nerdy kid. And so during my undergraduate, I studied evolutionary biology and animal behavior and was really blown away by the power of evolutionary theory to help us understand animal behavior. Um, and so then as I was finishing undergrad and transitioning into my PhD, I thought, like, what aspect of behavior is more interesting than all of the cool things humans do, than music, than religion, than morality, than visual art, than storytelling? And so really impressed with the power of evolutionary theory to tell us about animal behavior. I wanted to shift into anthropology and to use it to understand those things about human behavior I thought were most cool. And anthropology was like an excuse or an opportunity to travel, to visit new places, to get out of my comfort zone. And so I've really appreciated that.
Obviously, the book is a major accomplishment, but what is another achievement that you're proud of?
What is another achievement that I'm proud of? Um, Honestly, I'm like pretty proud when I teach a class and then it comes back and people like the students give me a high a high rating. Um, that is something I'm really proud of. I'm proud of.
Tell us about your family.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about my daughter. I'm like, can I actually take ownership over my family, over like my, so I have a 21-month-old baby, and she is glorious. Her name's Zora. I also have a beautiful wife, Nina. Um, and it's incredible to watch Zora just like constantly grow and there's a picture of her right here, so I'm like actually looking at a picture of her. Um, and I'm impressed with how she's developing. Like, to what extent, do I have an influence of that? Can I take pride in it? I'm not sure, but that is actually like the kind of prevailing element of my life at the moment is my family.
Manvir, what are you excited to be working on next? Do you have another book project in mind?
I'm thinking a lot about like myth and narrative and story. So I just had a piece in the New Yorker last week on patterns in story and is there some like original myth that manifests in the world around us? I'm working on another piece. It should be out next week on the history of monsters. So I'm interested in echoes, as with shamanism and resonances, and myth is something I've long been super fascinated with. So hopefully you'll see a book on that in the coming years.
Again, the title of the book is Shamanism. You should definitely read it because it is an interesting topic that really explains so much about our world today. If you're not able to buy it, definitely check it out from your local library. Manvir, where can people find you online? You're active on social media, right?
Yeah, so they can find me. I have a website, manvir.org, manvir.org. I have an X account, and it's just my name, Manvir Singh without the vowels. And then I have a Blue Sky account, manvir.bluesky.social. I have a LinkedIn account. I'm like somewhat active on social media. I feel like the social media game is constantly changing. The landscape is constantly evolving, and it's hard to keep up. But yeah, those are the places.
I'll put the links for all of those and for the book in the show notes. Manvir, thank you so much for joining us on Books in Five.
Thank you so much for having me, Pavan. It was so fun.
The host of Books in Five is Bhavan Sudan. Books in Five is produced in collaboration with Podfather Creative in Vancouver, Canada.